What's cooking, everybody? Dave Altizer here with Kinotika. Today we're talking about the RX100 VI and reviewing it specifically for photos. The Sony RX100 series has been around for a while now, and the RX100 VI in particular has been a really powerful camera that a lot of people have used, not only for vlogging and video people, but photographers as well. You've got a great image out of this sensor, great autofocus performance, it's small, and it's an alternative to using your mobile phone for photography. On the topic of comparing this to cell phones, one of the RX100 VI's biggest advantages is having a super zoom built into the lens. 24mm equivalent to 200mm equivalent. This is a 1-inch sensor, so technically speaking, it's a 9mm to 72mm, but I'm just gonna call it a 24 to 200. There's really nothing like this camera on the market right now. I mean, look at this thing. It is tiny. It really is about the same size, if not smaller. Yeah, it's smaller than my phone. And once you take this EVF and put it in like this, it's actually quite possible to stick it pretty much anywhere. Somebody's gonna be like, hey man, you got smoke? Oh no, man, that's just my RX100. Anyways, speaking about this super zoom, let's look at some of the images that we got. As you can see here with this image, we've got this boat on this little dock here right by Nashville. There's a little river in Nashville. It's pretty cool. This is at 24mm at f2.8. The sharpness on the image is overall pretty decent. We are seeing some distortion in the corners here. These are supposed to be straight lines on these buildings here. And as you can see on the edges, the buildings are quite distorted. That is something that I noticed when I was experimenting with vlogs and selfie mode on this camera. When you zoom all the way out, there is some heavy distortion. I mean, look at that building. That building is literally supposed to be straight up. So let's zoom in all the way to 200mm here of this boat. And look at that. Look at that range. I mean, if I A/B this, it's kind of unbelievable how much range you actually get here. 24mm here, 200mm here. And having a camera that's this size with such a range is really why I would recommend having this camera if you're going to Italy or you're on a honeymoon or you're just needing one camera to kind of do everything, especially if you're outdoors and you're not going to be indoors often. Then this one camera could really be kind of the ultimate travel companion. Now let's take a look at the burst rate of this camera. This camera can do 24 frames per second bursts up to 10 to 15 seconds, and then it starts kind of buffering and going a little bit slower. And then when you're done bursting off a bunch of images, it does take roughly 60 seconds for the camera to process that. But still, the burst rate is pretty amazing. We get full autofocus and the images are coming out really crisp. As you can see here, Connor was walking towards me with the gimbal. I'm just gonna hold the arrow key down here so that you can see what it looks like. 24 frames per second is obviously the same amount of frames in a video, so it does look a lot like a video. And I'll pause here so that you can see the sharpness here. I'm at roughly 50mm. The sharpness is great. It's tracking on Connor's face. I remember when I was taking these pictures, there was a box around his face because the camera actually recognized that was a human and he was walking towards me, even though he had sunglasses on and a camera in front of his face. The closer and closer he gets to, we do see a little bit of nice bokeh going on in the background. It looks a little bit more professional, and these are things that you're gonna get especially on the more telephoto end on this camera. Because we have a small sensor, if you can go to 50mm and up to 200mm, that's where you're going to get a lot of that bokeh, kind of cheat the system a little bit and make this camera look better than it actually is. I will say, as I was holding the camera though, I didn't feel very comfortable. This EVF here is nice to have, but man, is it tiny. I also wear glasses, and the EVF was banging the glass of my glasses. It was really hard to just kind of keep everything perfect like this. Another thing that I'd like to mention is if you can get some sort of grip here, I would really recommend it, especially if you're going to be shooting like this a lot. The grip here is non-existent. It's just a nice metal grip here, which is kind of nice to look at, but it's not very practical to hold. One of the new things about the RX100 VI is the improved color science that Sony is implementing in the A7R III, the A7 III, and now the RX100 VI. I hope they continue this trend towards making their images look more natural, have better skin tones. And I really feel like they've kind of nailed it here. The skin tones on the RX100 VI are much better than what I'm used to seeing on Sony. We've actually run through all of the picture profiles. Well, not all of them, just the ones that I liked. These are some of the basic profiles. These are some of the neutral profiles here. And these are some of the creative styles. You can see Connor's super washed out here, but it looks super moody. If I move on, this one's vivid. I really like how that looks. It's great. The skin tones look natural. If you told me this was a Sony, I might believe it, but the image is much more Canon-like to me, which is good. This is what autumn looks like in the creative style section. It's called Autumn Leaves, I think. It really warms the image up and looks even more nice on skin tones. Really creamy, great oranges and reds. And there's sepia. So this camera has sepia. I want to just show this image because it really shows why having a 200mm zoom is so handy dandy. This image is really fun for me because with a mobile phone, you just cannot zoom in to 200mm. And I think, again, that's what Sony is wanting you to realize. Even if you have a phone that has a 24mm and a 50mm lens like my iPhone 10, this gives you so much more range, but for so much money. All the previous images that you were looking at were JPEGs. Now we're going to look at a raw image. So we pulled this image into Affinity Photo here, and as you can see, the image has been overexposed by 2 stops. So we are going to immediately just go over here to the exposure slider and start to pull that down and see what happens. As you can see in the buildings here, we are still saving a lot of those highlights. It does look like we are losing a little bit of detail here. I overexposed by 2 stops completely. Definitely way more overexposed than it needs to be, but I am able to recover that fairly easily. We took another image that was underexposed by 2 or 3 stops. Let's pull that in Affinity Photo and see how it performs. So as you can see, this picture of these leaves here is totally dark. Let's immediately go over to the exposure slider and start to pull that up. It does look like it was holding all that information, and because this is a raw photo, I don't know if Affinity Photo actually fully supports the RX100. We are getting some crazy vignetting here on the corners, which is kind of goofy looking to me. It's noisy. Look at the shadows here, a lot of grain, a lot of noise. This camera is not a camera that you would want to use in a professional shooting environment. I would only use this probably in JPEG mode, traveling, family, things like that. Just quick and easy. Truly an iPhone replacement camera. So the raw performance is a little lackluster, but before I move on to the ISO performance, I just want to show some of these images here. This picture of this flower, kind of the basic, I don't know how to take pictures picture. Zoom in on a flower, get some nice bokeh, and it looks nice. Because it's sort of a macro image, we do have some nice bokeh going on. This is a f4.5 zoomed in all the way to 200mm, and that is kind of nice. The next image here, I tried to get a little bit closer and I could not nail my focus. I think that's interesting because the minimum focus distance is actually not very good. That really shows off by me simply going from this position to this one, threw off the focus completely. Unfortunately, this lens is not macro compatible. These next 2 images were taken in selfie mode, and if you're not aware, this LCD does flip all the way up into selfie mode. This camera has a smile detect feature, and it works pretty well. As soon as the camera detects that you're smiling, it snaps photo. Kind of cute. Another thing that's kind of neat with the RX100 VI that the previous model didn't have is a fully 90-degree angle on the screen here, which means you can do those top-down food shots. So let's move on to ISO performance now. Because this lens is a little bit slower than its previous model, I was hoping that the ISO performance would be improved with this newer camera, and because I didn't have an RX100 VI to directly compare it to, I can't do a direct comparison, but I will say that the ISO performance is decent. But if you really need low light performance and a camera of this size, unfortunately you might have to go with the previous model. Anyways, let's look at some of the images here with the ISO performance. I went ahead and just started straight with ISO 800, everything looks good. It's clean, the color looks good, the shadows are fine. 800 is good. Let's move on to 1250 ISO, and we're still looking pretty clean. It's a little muddy here in these areas in the shadows and stuff, and the color does not look as pretty. Moving on to 2500, we're definitely starting to see some noise. And of course at 6400, quite a bit. I'll even have to change this in post a little bit. Yes, there is a ton of noise. If you're looking at a phone though, you could add some visco film to that, add a little bit of grain, and people would think that the noise in the image was done intentionally. Moving on to 10,000 ISO, total crap. The image is completely falling apart. And of course, if we go to 12,800, it is completely gone. I would probably stay around the no higher than 2500 ISO range. So it's not completely useless, but because that lens is so much slower than the previous model, it just really shows off the poor ISO performance, especially if you're indoors. So how does the overall zoom performance perform? Let's take a look. Here we have 24 millimeters. And like I said earlier, the edges are pretty bad. That is to be expected. There are a lot of compromises that come into play when you have such an extreme zoom, but the overall sharpness is pretty good. If you look at Connor here, he looks sharp. There's no distortion going on at 24 millimeters, but you gotta watch out for those edges. Moving on to the 50 millimeter, I say 50 in air quotes because it's hard to like nail exact zoom. It's like 43.7 or something. But anyways, this is my 50 equivalent. There is much better performance on the corners here. It's sharper. The overall image quality is sharp and good. 50 millimeters looks good to me. This is 85 millimeters. Again, very similar to 50. It's looking sharp. There isn't that distortion again on the edges. Moving on to all the way zoomed in at 200, and that's where you get to see that bokeh coming into play in the background. Even though we're at f4.5, you get that bokeh because you're zoomed in. It's that little cheat that is kind of known in photography. If you shoot on a telephoto lens, you get just a really creamy bokeh. We are getting that. The corners look great. The sharpness overall looks great. If I were you and I was using this camera, I would tend to pretty much shoot from 50 on. And if you have to have a super wide for those selfie modes or for just like a landscape shot, that's fine. But if you're doing portraits of people, definitely zoom into 50 millimeters and on to 200 millimeters even. When I was shooting with this camera, I noticed that my battery was about to die. We only have one battery, so I was kind of freaking out. Thankfully, I brought my little battery charger and we plugged it in over USB. It was great to see that you don't have to just charge it while the camera's turned off. Of course, it'll charge faster if you do that, but you can charge it while you're using the camera. And that is a feature that I hope more cameras have in the future. The camera also has a panoramic mode, and we played with that. It looked okay. It's fun. It's a nice little thing to have. The camera doesn't have a time-lapse feature, which I think is a little strange. Ever since the newer models, the A7R III, the A7 III, and now this. Really a shame because I love doing time-lapse. I think this camera would be a great time-lapse camera, but I don't know. Maybe Sony will fix that in a firmware update. I think overall, the RX100 VI is kind of an interesting beast. It can, I guess, be used for pros if you're using 50 millimeters onto 200 and this is like a backup camera, like, oh crap, my big camera broke and this is all I got. Or you want to be discreet and small and have that zoom range. If you're a journalist or something like that, it's pretty great. But I really think this camera has its place in the market as an alternative to your phone. It's giving you much more range, better dynamic range, better color, better overall sharpness than your phone would give you, and it's as small as a phone. But here's the thing that's so weird about it. The pricing of this is not a consumer price. It's $1,200 for this camera. An iPhone 10 costs $1,000, and most consumers aren't even rocking iPhone 10s. They're using $500 version iPhones or Androids or things like that. If this camera was $500, $700, I think it would be much more practical and would be something that I would recommend to people who just want a great all-around camera. But because it's $1,200, I really can't see anybody really buying this unless you need that super zoom or you want to just rent one for a vacation. We hope you guys enjoyed this video on the RX100 VI for stills. If you did, give us a thumbs up, and if you're new here, please subscribe. We're happy to have you and we want you to be a part of the fam. Once again, I'm Dave Altizer. This is Kinotika. See you next time.